This is the Fundamental Escape podcast with your host, Mark Fitzgerald. Today we interviewed Brian McLaren. Mark, how did you feel about the interview?
Yeah, well, we'll get to that in a little while, but first of all, I just want to point out the obvious. You sound a little bit different to our usual introduction voice that we normally hear.
Yeah, where did David go?
Yeah, good question. So, David is taking a virtual holiday, I suppose you could say. But in all seriousness, this is our guest host, Rachel, who is going to be popping up from time to time, potentially in the near future, to guest host some episodes, which is really, really cool. And I'm really, really excited. So we obviously came across each other through Blab, and you were doing a few sort of interviews and stuff like that. And I have to say, I was definitely compelled with the style that you have in asking questions and things like that. So do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that and how you approach your interview style and asking questions in these sort of conversations?
Absolutely, Mark. Thanks. I'm so glad to be here. Well, I'm excited to be a part of the Fundamental Escape podcast because really I have no problem asking questions, in all honesty. And the questions that you ask, Mark, are so compelling about humanity and about God. I'll definitely stand up when something rubs me the wrong way, but I believe that we can give our opinions about things and have a conversation and dialogue at the same time. But also, I'm all for learning, I'm all for growing and being better, because when I first met you, Mark, I believe that we met on Blab and I was interviewing different ministers and pastors about their views on things. And I just wanted to ask some deeper questions. And I really feel like your podcast does that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's cool. That's what we want to be doing. And I think that's what we are doing, which is fantastic. So it's really cool to have you on board. I think people will totally appreciate a different voice, because I'm sure they get sick of hearing me all the time. But just to dive into this whole conversation with Brian McLaren, I have to geek out a little bit, I suppose. Brian McLaren is a prolific author. He's written about 20 plus books. A Generous Orthodoxy was one of the first books I read, which really impacted me. He's written a book called A New Kind of Christianity, where he asks 10 questions essentially that are around, rethinking the Christian faith and things like that. He's a very quiet, mild-mannered kind of guy, and he's really great to talk to. It was great. It was actually a live interview, so I have to point out, you will notice a little bit of a difference in the recording. We were in the same room, which was great. But yeah, Rachel, I just want to throw it over to you a little bit, because I know you've obviously listened to the conversation and you have a few different points of view to me, which I think is well invited and great to put on the table. So do you want to maybe throw some thoughts out there?
Well, with regard to Brian McLaren, I believe it's always this need to reinvent church. And with the emergent church, a lot of people are afraid of the emergent church. In fact, when I first came across it, I was intrigued by the emergent church and just by Brian McLaren in general. But when you get down to it, there are some things that he says which I'm not too sure about it. And I have to go back and really kind of question what he's actually talking about. Because to me, being a Christian isn't a guaranteed ticket to heaven or my get out of hell free card. Being a Christian is striving to live a life like Christ and to love others. I feel like Brian is pointing towards that, but are we asking the right questions? And I believe he is trying to dig deeper, but I don't know if I'm on the same plane as him with everything he's talking about.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. I totally appreciate your honesty. I think it's good. And I definitely want to invite differences of opinion to the table, and that's part of the reason I'm really happy to have you on board, because I think, I don't want to be seen to just be talking to people that agree with me and things like that. And even on the podcast up until this point, there's been different conversations we've had that I definitely don't agree with everything that everybody's said, and I just want to put that out there in case everybody thinks that I do, because I totally don't. And I think, the most important thing is that people are thinking and are questioning and are, sort of being critical about these sort of things, because it is important. I mean, at least I think it's important. So Was there any other sort of key points to raise in regards to the conversation that you feel is important?
Well, I think it was really interesting, Mark, that you almost stated it without stating it, that how God never stops loving us. You guys kind of got to a point at the very end where you both were just nodding your heads in agreement as you were speaking. And it was almost it was beautiful to hear. And I think that, to hear the idea that we don't have to check a bunch of boxes in order to get it right. And I guess Brian would want to say in order to get it good, because he wouldn't want to say right or wrong.
Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful thing to know, that we don't have to have everything in line in order for our lives to be set.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, like I said, I mean, for me, Brian McLaren is somebody who, again, I'm not saying, I don't want to come across like I don't question anything he says at all, but he was definitely someone that was a voice for me in a time where I felt like there wasn't room for me. And we discussed that. I actually quoted back to him one of the lines of his book where he talks about, people feeling like there isn't room for them within the Christian faith. And that's a huge, huge part of what I'm wanting to do, because I know firsthand that there are so many people out there that essentially have been told, they get handed this all or nothing idea of faith where it's like, you can have all of it or none of it sort of thing. And I want to be able to push back on that and say, no, be like, no, there is space for you. And hopefully we can create that. So, unless there was anything else you wanted to wrap up with, I guess we can just throw it across to the interview.
All right, let's hear it.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to the Fundamental Escape podcast. I'm here today with a very special guest who's actually in the same room as me for a change, Brian McLaren, who is an author and a speaker, among other things. So do you want to just say hi there, Brian?
Yeah, good to be with you all. I'm actually here in New Zealand, and if you look out the window here, we've got some sheep on the hillside. I know I'm really here.
Yes, we do. I think we do have a lot of sheep here in New Zealand. Cool. Awesome. So, first of all, what brings you to New Zealand?
Well, I came here at the invitation of smallternative.org and Rob Kilpatrick, who's a longtime friend, and Mark Pearson and others. I've been here several other times before, but I'll be speaking in a variety of churches, seminaries, colleges, both here and on the South Island.
Awesome. So I thought I would start off just to give you a bit of an idea of where I'm coming from. With my guests, I like to sort of explain to them the point in which I came in contact with them and how I was, introduced to them. So long story short, I have talked about this on other podcasts. So I grew up in the church my whole life. It was my world. I went to a Christian school. I only listened to Christian music. It was just an entire world that I inhabited, and didn't really ask too many questions, just went along with everything that was handed to me along the way, and ended up, shortly after leaving high school, I ended up becoming involved in street evangelism. So I was a street evangelist for around 5 years.
Wow.
And I was able to do it full time at some points through the help and support of people in my church, which was quite amazing. And so that was an interesting time because, there's all kinds of feelings that come with that. On the one hand, you feel like you're out saving the world. Mm-hmm. You're doing this big epic thing. And then on the other hand, there are all these underlying reasons that you sort of come across later where you're like, oh, this is almost like a struggle to be important and to be recognized and valued and all this kind of thing. So long story short, after 5 years of doing it, I basically hit extreme burnout. And I had a psychological breakdown essentially, which was, so that was, not pretty. Yeah. So that was in 2008. And coming out of that, I genuinely didn't know if I could still hold on to my faith. Yeah. Because, the way I describe it is, the bricks that you've built your life with essentially have just crumbled to the ground. Yeah. And you're like, you can't rebuild with the same materials. Yeah. Yeah. And I was just in this state of devastation of like, what am I going to do? Yeah. Where am I going to go? And, a really good friend of mine, I'm not a kind of person who has like 100 friends. I'm like one of those people that has like 5 really good friends. Yes. And one of my really good friends that I grew up with, he actually gave me a couple of Rob Bell's books. So, Velvet Elvis and Sex God. And I am not a reader, I am more now, but I wasn't then. And I just devoured those books within like 2 days each kind of thing. And I was just like, oh, wow. And it started opening up this space for me. And then eventually I had a friend of mine who was actually running the youth group at our church. And I hate to drop names because I'm not trying to be contentious, but he was a big fan of Mark Driscoll. And so that was his kind of thing, and that was his path. And he started talking to me about this thing called the Emergent Church, and he would bring it up all the time. And I was like, before that, I'd never even heard of it. So if it wasn't for him bringing it up, I wouldn't be none the wiser. And I got to a point of just absolute curiosity, and I was like, because he would always talk about it in a negative light, obviously. Yes. And I was like, what is he talking about? Like, I want to know what he's actually saying. And so I ended up, one of the first books I read was Generous Orthodoxy. And you hooked me right from the beginning, I'll be honest with you. Like, there was that line where you basically said, maybe you've been told that there's no room for you within the Christian faith. And then you say, I'm here to tell you that there is, but maybe I'm naive. And I just really sensed the empathy in those words, and I was like, wow. Like, I was like, maybe there is some space here. And it just sort of opened up this, like I say, this kind of space of going, wow. And I have heard you, I can't remember exactly where it was, but you talk about those sort of 4 transition points that we go through where we're like part of the tribe, and then we start to sort of ask questions. Yeah. And that's the most contentious place to be. Yes, yeah. And I can definitely testify to the truth of that because it really is, because it's so much easier. And actually this just kind of jumped straight into one of my questions was, I sometimes wonder, do you often think that it would have been easier just to not ask these questions and do this deconstructing? Because you're like, on the one hand, it opens up this beautiful possibility, but then you're like, on the other hand, you're just like, oh, wow.
Yeah. Gosh, you're making me think of a email I got. I think it was on a Monday morning, and the guy said, "I just came into my office. I was a youth pastor until this morning. The pastor called me into his office and said, are you reading books by Brian McLaren?" I said yes. He said, "Do you like them?" I said yes. He said, "You're fired." And he said something like, "Thanks for ruining my life." Yeah. Of course, he didn't mean it as it sounded. But there is a cost, to asking these questions, and it tells you something about a group that is so fragile and so paranoid, and this sounds like a totalitarian regime. So, but you're right. There's a sense that it would be so much easier if you didn't ask questions. If the purpose of life is to not rock the boat, and stay part of these fear-based groups. Yeah. But so you're right. It's a high cost. Yeah. But you then realize a lot of us are incapable of suppressing the questions. We just can't. We can't be who we are. Yeah. And then you think I feel like I have met people who had the questions and suppressed them, and they seem either cynical or kind of artificial, So there is a loss.
No, I totally hear what you're saying. I mean, I actually had a friend of mine who he's had some sort of mental health issues as well, and he's been through similar experiences to me, but yet he's found himself going back to the sort of fundamental position. Yeah. And I just kind of scratch my head and go, how is that even possible? Yeah. Like, how can you do that? Like, I would just have to literally shut off so much of my being to go back to that place. And this is where I find it very hard. And, when you're sort of interacting, because you've still got friends and family that you grew up with.
Oh, exactly.
And they're not in that same place. And it's, it's so hard to...
It's very stressful to show up for a holiday meal and know that all of your relatives have you on their prayer list. And so But, I'm glad you bring up that example of your friend, because, there are a lot of us who've been so wounded that the threat of having our acceptance withdrawn is just too great a threat. And so we are willing to capitulate. And sadly, a lot of those people are you realize this is the mechanism of cults.
Yeah.
That's how cults work.
Well, I just heard you'd be familiar with Carlton Pearson.
Yes.
Yeah, he was just on a podcast with Rob Bell, and they were just talking about, you know, his kind of story and everything, and he was saying to Rob how basically he has people that come to him like in secret, essentially, and say, "We still love you. We still love you. Keep saying what you're saying. Keep doing what you're doing." And he said they say to him essentially, "Please understand, this is a business decision."
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, whoa,
I do.
So, yeah, and I guess, you know, going back to where I sort of started in my story and where I've come from, going through these sort of traumatic experiences, I feel like there is a, you know, especially in regards to, you know, mental health is one of those things where it's still not really talked about openly in the world, as far as I can see. It is in some places, but especially in the church as well. It seems to be one of those things where we're just like, we don't know what to do with this. Yeah. And, you know, I have to deal with it myself and kind of navigate it. And, you know, like I say, for me, like prior to my breakdown, I felt like a very strong person mentally, and I still do. But at the same time, I'm just like,
oh man,
it's a hard one.
You know, it is, and you are helping a lot of people by being open about that in your experience.
I hope so. I hope I am.
I know you are, and it has to happen more. You know, one of the problems in traditional Christian theology that Christians have to stand up and courageously face is that the old model of the human being, I call it the ghost in the machine model, that there's a spirit in your body. It can't account for mental illness, you know, because the spirit is the separate entity from the body. But we've got to get beyond that and realize, no, human beings, one theologian, to use a big name for it, the theologian said that we're psychosomatic units. You know, the soul and the body are deeply connected. And so just as you can get, you know, an infection in your skin or a strain in your muscle or a break in a bone or a malfunction in your, you know, intestines or liver, you know, our brains are fragile organs. Yeah. And so we have to come to terms with how embodied we are. Yeah. If we don't do it about mental illness, we'll have to do it about things like Alzheimer's and senile dementia and so on. This is part of life. We've got to, and the stigma that people still associate with mental illness, it's horrible. It's cruel. It's wrong. Yeah. And it's interesting. That kind of does tie into something else I wanted to say as well, which was that, you know, you sort of talked about the idea where we have this disconnect between our body and our soul. Yeah. And I mean, especially when you grow up in the church, you grow up with this idea of like, this life essentially doesn't matter. I mean, you know, the teaching that I was under when I was basically doing all my evangelism was this world is a waiting room. Yes. And, you know, I talked about this with someone else on the podcast, but it's this idea that you're just waiting to die so that God can judge you. And this, I mean, it reminds me as well, I did want to bring up, you know, you talk in a new kind of Christianity about the 6-line Greco-Roman narrative. Yes. And that to me is, I mean, as someone who was a street evangelist myself, that model, you know, that's essentially what I was running on, was that 6-line narrative. And I just wonder where we can even begin to like disembed that or deconstruct that from our psyche and go, because even I struggle, and I see this to Kevin Miller as well, you know, even I struggle with it as someone who feels like I've moved so far away from that. I still feel like it's part of me. I'm like, what if all this like burning forever stuff is the story, and what if God is like this, and you know what I mean? And it's like, I do. You realize what passes for Orthodox Christianity very often, especially when you think of little children. You realize this is abusive. This is unhealthy. I remember being a little boy, 8 years old, at a Christian summer camp. and were marched way out into the forest,
Yeah.
And probably 3 or 4 miles out into the forest, and we come to this clearing in the forest, and a huge bonfire is blazing. And, I'm a little boy who hasn't been away from my mother before.
Yeah.
And a preacher gets up at the bonfire and says, "See this fire? This is nothing compared to the fires of hell, where you will be forever."
Yeah.
I mean, you think, what kind of sick...
How does that translate to love as well? That's what I don't get. How does that motivate, this idea of again, I was taught this idea of you've got to go out and tell people exactly how bad they are, exactly how far they've wronged God, and then they're going to just magically love Jesus.
God loves you as a plan for your life, and if you don't accept it, He's going to torture you forever. So, yeah. but that taps into stuff in our brain. Deep. Our brains are wired for fear and to avoid danger, so we'll survive.
Yeah.
And so this is tapping into deep stuff. So a friend of mine in the States, her name is Reba Riley. She just wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Church Syndrome.
Oh, wow.
And there is a sense that this is trauma that's inflicted upon people.
Yeah.
But you asked, how can we get away from it? And I think this is the unfortunate reality. You know this from your own story. But a lot of us are given the idea that this is the Christian story. That 6-line narrative, that waiting room for heaven or hell narrative is the only Christian story. And if you don't like that, then you're out.
Yeah.
And I suppose an advantage I had, because I was a pastor, I actually had to read the Bible. And I remember this. I mean, once you see it, this is so unbelievably obvious.
Yeah.
But I'd been taught not to see it until I was at least 40 years old before I saw this.
Yeah.
Which is that the idea of going to heaven or hell after you die is nowhere in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so obvious.
It's crazy.
But, especially if you read the King James, because the King James translates the Hebrew word Sheol, which simply means the grave or the place of the dead, into hell. People read that back into the text, but it wasn't there.
Yeah.
And so you realize that narrative is very vulnerable, and that there are much better, more honest ways of reading the biblical text.
Yeah.
The problem is, if you're part of a church that never mentions those or doesn't allow those, then you don't even know they're there.
Yeah. One thing that's quite interesting, I think might be an interesting kind of topic to explore is, in 2015, we have social media. So everyone's connected.
Yes.
And, as I say, I grew up in a world where we didn't have that, as did you. And, the church could exist in this little bubble where it was not even connected to reality. Yeah. And that was sort of one of my questions is, why do we, it seems to me that, the world looks at Christianity as this, oh, you're a Christian, meaning, oh, that means you're disconnected from reality.
Yeah.
You're almost fake, kind of. And it's like, how do we get that authenticity? How do we get that back?
Yeah. Well,
if we ever have it.
For you, it took a mental breakdown, didn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, totally.
And for me, it took a lot of stress and challenge, and for a lot of other people, it takes a lot of pain to confront things. I really think, though, that the future can be different, because I think that there are more and more Christian communities that are welcoming the questions and welcoming people's honesty. And as soon as we've got a critical mass of those kind of Christian communities, there's another option out there.
Yeah.
But it's still true that for a lot of people, they don't live near one of those realities.
Yeah.
But sometimes you can find some of those communities online.
Yeah.
So thank God for that.
Yeah, so I had a guy, Gus Row, on the podcast. He's a New Zealander, and he actually was part of a ministry called Youth for Christ.
Uh-huh.
And he hasn't been in church for the last 8 years. He just stopped going, and he's sort of become very disenfranchised. And he was very honest on the podcast, and he started off the conversation by talking about an experience that he had in an ashram in India with a young guy who would wake him up every morning with a cup of hot chai and a smile, he said. And, this was a guy who was cleaning up AIDS patients and TB patients through the night and all this sort of thing, and just selflessly giving. And, yet he wasn't a Christian. He hadn't received the gospel. He was illiterate. He couldn't even understand his own language, let alone English. And, someone asked Gus, they said, do you think he's saved? Mm. And he goes, well, from an evangelical point of view, that raises a problem, because he said, by our standards, no, he's not. Yeah. But he said at the same time, he's more Christ-like than I am.
Yes.
And he was totally honest about that. And I don't know, I just sort of wonder, you seem to talk about, I've read, to be honest, I don't know if I actually read the whole book, but I did read parts of the Why Did Jesus, Moses, Buddha, and Muhammad
cross the road?
Could you make that more complicated as a title, by the way? And you talked about the idea of witness versus witness and things like that. So I did pick up bits and pieces from it. And you seem to talk about Christianity as a faith or a religion, if you will, I guess, that goes beyond itself. Yeah. A religion that doesn't exist for its own sake. Yeah. And I think that is something that's so foreign to us, because we fall back into that tribalism, and we become just like everyone else. We're just another tribe. Yeah. We're just another group. And it scares us to think about it differently. And I think going back to that 6-line Greco-Roman narrative idea, I think that's why that sticks so well, because we go, if you take that away, it's completely open. Yes. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so, going back to, so Gus was essentially saying, he came across to me as a little bit cynical, if I'm honest, and he will listen to this, but he's okay. But he said, back in the 70s we had this move of God, and in the 80s we had this, and and I was kind of with him, and then he goes, in the 2000s we had the emergent, and I was like, and I felt myself starting to get a little bit defensive. I was like, don't you speak against them, and he was kind of summing it up by going, well, what if, he goes, oh, they ask good questions. He did say that. He said they asked good questions, but he kind of goes, well, what are we left with? Yeah. What if it becomes so open, what he was coming back to, I think, was this idea that we're uncomfortable with, was if we can't quantify the numbers, and if we can't tick a box and say we've got this many salvations, then what is it? What are we about?
Well, look, this is where things get really interesting for me. Let's take that word salvation, and what we don't realize is when somebody uses the word, is so-and-so saved? Have they experienced salvation? There's a whole set of assumptions behind that word. And I remember when I started to ask the question as a pastor, does that word salvation mean in the Bible what we say it means? Right. Because there's this whole set of constructs. There's this thing called original sin. And original sin was an unknown concept in biblical times. It doesn't even arise until a few centuries after Christ. So, what does that word mean? Well, if you go back in the Old Testament, the fundamental meaning of the word saved or salvation is what God did for the Hebrew slaves under Egypt. What it really means is liberation. Are they set free? Now, here's the irony. The people who are asking, are you saved? Are you saved? Are you saved? Are very often some of the most imprisoned people in the world. They're imprisoned by fear. They're imprisoned by a violent vision of God. They're imprisoned by a social structure that won't let them ask questions and that constantly forces them to judge people as insiders or outsiders. I mean, those people need to be set free. Yeah. So that, when you put it in that way, you just realize we've got to ask the deeper questions. And, your friend or the fellow you interviewed on the podcast, he has every reason to be cynical because there's a lot to be cynical about. But then the question is, what are we going to do about it? And I think the reason I am not so cynical, I certainly have cynical, tendencies, but I ultimately believe if the God of the universe, the God who created the universe, if that God is actually a God of liberation, then that's really good news. Yeah. And we're in a lot of trouble still today, whatever our religion. Yeah. And I think we need a lot of liberation.
Yeah. I think here's my thought on it is I think if we take away the narrative of some people go to heaven and some people go to hell, it raises this deep question of then what am I fighting for?
Yes. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And then that becomes a fascinating thing. So I don't want to...
Which insinuates that people are only being Christians because they want to go to heaven. That's another whole conversation, maybe.
But you know what's interesting about that is you'll meet some Christians who say, yeah, if it weren't for heaven or hell, I wouldn't be in this thing. But then you meet other people and they say, no, you could take that away and my faith still has great value. It puts me in the world appreciating creation as having meaning. It puts me in the world with a desire to do good to my neighbors. It puts me in the world with a sense of the inherent goodness of creation and value of creation. Well, those are precious things,
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the opportunities when people face down the fear that, oh, this thing is only valuable as a ticket to heaven or a get out of hell free card or something. Then they can find out maybe there's some other value there. I look at this. I'll tell you who really helped me with this was my Buddhist friends. My Buddhist friends, and I had friends who were Buddhists back from when I was in high school, and especially in college, and they never asked me to become a Buddhist. They just felt like Buddhism had brought them these wonderful insights about the nature of suffering and the nature of the relationship between desire and suffering. And they thought that these were gifts that they wanted to share with everybody. So their approach was they wanted to share gifts with me. No threats, just gifts.
Yeah.
And I think that is very much the attitude of Jesus. It's interesting that the verse that always gets quoted is John 3:16, which interestingly says, for God so loved the world, everybody. And then the verse that I think ought to get quoted more is John 3:17, which is God didn't send his son into the world to condemn the world, but, and then comes this word saved. A better, I think, translation would be God sent his son into the world not to condemn the world, but to set the world free. Well, how does Jesus set people free? Well, one thing is he helps them think you don't have to be afraid of God. God isn't that kind of being you have to be afraid of. That's a pretty powerful liberation,
Yeah.
That's a gift for everybody.
Yeah. So I guess in that light, I mean, we sort of talked about the word salvation. I'll just sort of throw some other words at you.
Yeah.
That we don't, I mean, especially, I'll be honest, within the kind of emergent conversations, you don't hear much, at least I don't hear much these days, as, you talk about words like sin and judgment and things like that. Do those words still have relevance, or what? I mean, what are your thoughts on what?
It's interesting. If people read my books, what they'll see is I'll use words like evil, injustice, oppression, shame. I'll use words like suicidal tendencies, and those are my paraphrases of the word sin. Partly because the way that religious people have used the word sin has trivialized it. It's turned it into these little peccadillos that might get you in hell. And so I think the concept behind it is more important than ever. I'll give you an example. I'm from the U.S. Our country has racism deeply embedded in it. And we try to cover it up, but it's there. And, people are seeing in the news these stories about police killings and people waving Confederate flags. And there's this deep-seated racism. That's sin. That's wrong. If what we mean by sin is something that's wrong and destructive and offensive and unhealthy and destructive. That's certainly out there, and we've got to face it. I just think what's tragic is our religious communities will make people feel very guilty about, let's say sex, but they won't make people feel guilty about racism.
Yeah, we pick and choose. Yeah. I mean, in that regard, I mean, obviously, just in America, gay marriage has just become legal across the board, and I don't want to go into too much depth on that because I've heard you speak on it in other places, but I mean, I've got two family members who are gay, and to me it does seem like one of those issues that's not it's just an issue until it becomes a person.
Yeah, that's right. That's it. That's right.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I when you're confronted with it in flesh and blood, you have to go, wait a minute, this is a real person. And
exactly right.
The other thing about it, though, I think there's another side to it, is I came across a post on Facebook where someone was essentially saying, if you're anti-gay marriage and if you're against gay people or whatever, you're automatically homophobic and a bigot.
Yeah.
And I was just like, really? I sort of read it again. I was like, is that true? I was like, I don't think that's accurate. Because I know from someone who grew up in the church, there are many loving, kind, compassionate people who, A, just don't confront the issue because it's not a reality in their life, and B, are operating out of a worldview and a system that is the best they have.
Yeah.
So how do we, and again, I had a conversation with a friend last night as well on the subject, and he was talking about the idea of, seeing gay people as less than and all this kind of stuff. And I kind of turned it around on him, and I said, do you think a gay person can't look at someone else as less than as well? I was like, this sword cuts both ways.
Yeah, sure. This is a human problem.
It's a human, exactly. And it's when we put someone in the status, and I think that's doing a disservice to the gay community personally, when you put them in that victim status, essentially, like, oh, you're incapable of marginalizing someone else because they're as human as we are.
Well, let me make a couple comments on that. First, one of the things that's going on there is it's related. The word sin, the word homophobia, the word racism. We have to realize that words have a dictionary definition, but in any particular conversation, they also have a kind of, my background, I was an English guy, so they have a performative function. And they have a kind of rhetorical purpose in any given context. So let's use the word racist. Somebody says, you're a racist. Well, the person says, I'm not a racist. I don't make people slaves. I don't burn crosses. I don't hold flags over people. I don't use, insulting terminology. Yeah. But maybe the person who said that, what they mean is, no, but you have unexamined assumptions within you that you didn't choose, that you just inherited from your upbringing, that you've never examined, that make you interact with people of other races with an attitude of privilege or superiority. Now, by saying you're a racist, very often they make the person defensive and less willing to face those deeper realities. Yeah. My guess is, even though they might be right, you see, and my guess is when people call other people homophobic, they're doing it trying to say, you don't realize the unspoken assumptions that you have. But by doing it in that combative way, they just make people defensive, So,
totally.
So that's...
I learned that. I'm a salesman. You realize pretty quickly nobody likes to be told bluntly that they're wrong. It's right. Like you've got to gently help them see, exactly the truth. So, and that kind of, I suppose, opens into something I had a thought on, which was this idea where people can sort of latch onto ideas because they're like trendy or cool or, and I sort of wonder, especially with the whole emergent movement and everything, it seems to, like I say, for me, I know that I can definitely testify to the genuineness and the support that I found through it. But at the same time, I kind of, in some places, I get this vibe where I'm just like, these people are like over here going, oh, we're cool, we deconstruct and we doubt and we ask questions, and it's like there's something about it that's like, do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, I do. I totally do. And I would, I think that's a problem that comes up. It's one of the reasons I try not to use these terms very much. I just try to talk about the things we need to talk about and not try to create, in-grouping and out-grouping of any kind is problematic. I actually think this is part of what the New Testament is really addressing in what it means to be set free. It means to be set free from the need to create in-groups and out-groups. So Paul says, in Christ there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, and so on. And we could say Protestant or Catholic, conservative or liberal, emergent or whatever.
Yeah.
And I love how he said it in 2 Corinthians. He said, from now on we recognize no one from an earthly point of view. Everything's in Christ. There's a new creation. Everything's new. So we just try to start seeing people as people.
Yeah. I mean,
look, labels have use. People say conservative, liberal. Well, those are useful terms, but we also have to be aware they're they are stereotypical.
Yeah.
Stereotyping.
Yeah. I'm sort of in this place where I'm trying to consciously learn to value, things over here and things over here, and, like not to get into that. Because I admit, like, I've done it many times in my life where, I'll listen to someone's teaching and I'll just like completely subscribe and go, I'm on this bandwagon, and then that doesn't work for a while, and then I'm like, okay, I'm over here now, and then like I do that. I just have this tendency, and I don't know if it's just me or I guess other
I
people
think it's
do
a
it as
human
well.
tendency. I call that a lateral conversion, meaning we're in this one group, and then we join another group with exactly the same mindset.
Yeah.
And I think what you're talking about is experiencing what we might call a forward conversion, where you don't just adopt another point of view with the same mindset you did before, but now, in a sense, your way of thinking is expanded a little bit. You're seeing it a different way.
So there's something I wanted to touch on a little bit on a personal note, and I'm curious because you've been on the planet longer than I have. That's a diplomatic way of saying it. But I'm in this sort of space now where I guess the word I would use is numb. Like, I feel kind of numb when it comes to spirituality. I feel like I've gone through this, as I say, growing up in the church all my life, and then kind of moving out of that and seeing things in a new light. And then kind of, I don't know, like sometimes I listen to atheists and the way they talk, and I'm like, they almost talk with more wonder and awe for the universe than religious people. And I'm going, am I missing something here? Like, what is going on? And it's just curious to me. And I guess, would you say in your experience or in your life, is there times where you've gone through lulls or periods where you're just kind of like, am I a believer anymore? Is this even reality? Like, what's the deal? Because to me, it doesn't feel like the church creates space for that. The church creates this space where it's like, you tick these boxes, you adhere to this system, and if you don't, you're out. And I was experienced that firsthand when I started reading, books like yours and Rob Bell's, because I didn't get physically kicked out of my tribe, essentially, but at the same time, people immediately started treating me very differently. And it was like this other level. It was just like this surface, oh, hey, Mark, how are you? Kind of, and that's as far as it would go. And I just, you sort of do stop and wonder, like, I've kind of gone on this big journey, and I appreciate it, and I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm sure there's more in front of me, but at the moment, I'm just like, numb.
I'll tell you a story that I think relates to what you're saying. Years ago, I was on the board of this Christian organization. We needed to hire a new president. So we're interviewing this guy. And one of the people on the committee says, well, could you tell us about your walk with the Lord? I think is the way of saying it. And the guy got a little tense. He said, look, I'm a paid religious professional. I get paid to love God.
Wow.
He said, if you're asking me if I really do love God, I really do. But now to ask me to prove it to you so you'll give me a job, so he says, can I just say to you, I really love God, in spite of the fact that I get paid to love God. And this is, do you see what I think he was really onto something, that when our love for God or appreciation of life, when it becomes utilitarian, we run the risk of ruining it. I was a college English teacher, and then I became a pastor. It was much harder to have a relationship with God as a pastor than it was when I was working in the quote secular world, because there's all these things where your faith is made utilitarian. I think something similar happens when we go through struggles of faith. So a subject comes up, and it becomes a matter of argument that we have to take sides on, and we lose touch with the thing itself. Now the question, what do you do about that, is tough. I had this guy when I was a pastor who was part of a Christian organization. I'll name the organization. It was called Campus Crusade for Christ. They changed it. I know. And every week he had to give reports. How many people have I shared my faith with? How many hours have I spent in prayer and Bible study? Everything was quantified.
Sounds like our church.
So he was talking to me, and he's really struggling. And I said to him, look, you got to promise me you're not going to tell the Crusade people what I'm about to tell you. I said, but you're coming to me as a member of my church, and I'm your pastor. I said, look, I want you to promise me that for the next week you won't read your Bible, you won't pray, and you won't witness to anybody. And I said, now I want you to tell me something you love to do just as a human being. He says, I love to play basketball. I said, when was the last time you played basketball? He says, oh, it's been like a year. I said, okay, look, do you know a place you can play basketball this week? He said, yeah, there's a group down at the gym. I said, look, I want you to go play basketball. And at the end of playing basketball, I want you to say one prayer of 2 words. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I said, that's the only prayer. And I want you to do that this week, and then we'll talk next week. And then next week, he said, it really felt good. I said, do it another week. And I can't remember how many weeks we went. But after a little time, when he wasn't being forced to do all these things to prove something or whatever, it was the enjoyment of it was able to
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting because I actually talked to a good friend last night as well. And in our conversation, he said something along the lines of, it was to do with basically the idea of, needing to do things like so that God will love you sort of thing. So that I need to spend time with God. I need to pray. I need to do these things. And I was just like, do you really think that, the divine is affected by these things we do or don't do? And I actually shared with him because there was a teacher I used to listen to that used to open up like the Hebrew language and talks about the festivals and all that kind of thing. And he said how the only Jewish festival where, because all their festivals they were commanded to have bread without leaven because leaven was sin. Yeah. But the only festival they were commanded to eat bread with leaven was the day of Pentecost. And the priest would raise up the bread and break it open and pour oil through the bread. And he would say, now the oil flows through leaven. And I shared that with him and I was like, that's the good news. That's the good news that God loves us, leaven and all.
Oh, that's great.
That's what I think, and that's what gets me is that we're so, going back to this whole law. I mean, Paul talks about the law and how the law just creates awareness of sin, and it doesn't eradicate sin. It just makes us more conscious of it. And it's like I feel like we're almost at this precipice. We're just like right on the edge. Yeah. And it's like it's just going. Am I actually going to trust in the love of God and go, it's enough, instead of going, all this other stuff was never sufficient anyway.
Oh my goodness. That's really well said. And that's where you can see that if, for a lot of people, if every time they hear the word God, they think guilt, shame, pressure, evaluation, threat, risk, all this negativity, you can see that for a person to become an atheist is an incredible relief.
Oh, totally.
They get to enjoy
totally.
life again,
Yeah.
And I can't help but think that, obviously to, anthropomorphize God, but God's, up in heaven cheering, saying, oh, good, I'm so glad you're enjoying life because,
well, actually, Peter Rollins actually tells a story where he said it was a parable that a friend of his wrote. You may have heard this, I'm not sure, but he said it was a parable, essentially, his friend had written as he left the Christian faith. And it was him at the pearly gates waiting to get in as a Christian. And, St. Peter was there and, he's like, can I come in? He's like, yeah. And he turns around and he sees all these people behind him. And he said, some of them atheists, some of them Buddhists, some of them God knows what, he says. And he turns to Peter and goes, what about them? Can they come in as well? And St. Peter goes, no, you know the rules. You know the rules. Like, they're not allowed in. And he just pauses and he goes, you know what? I'm just going to wait out here with them.
Yeah.
And he said the parable ends with St. Peter just cracking a huge smile and going, finally someone gets it. Yeah. I was like, wow. Like, man alive. That's so awesome. I guess just to sort of wind down, we've been talking for a little while, which I really appreciate, by the way. Is there any sort of, I know you're sort of taking a bit of a break to do some writing and stuff at the moment. Is there anything that you want to, what's on your mind, on your heart at the moment that's been sort of...
Well, I look back on the decades that I've been involved with Christian ministry and work, and I just think we're at a really interesting moment. I think a lot of the things that people work very hard to keep afloat, and you use the example of a building, you build up all your bricks.
Yeah.
Well, the ship keep springing new leaks and the bricks keep falling to the ground. And I think there's a sense that if we allow some of that collapse to happen, that on the other side of that, that's when there's some new hope and some new possibility. And so that's one of the things I'm hopeful about. The writing project I'm involved with now is called Converting Christianity, and I'm talking about, that we Christians always talk about how everyone else needs to be converted, but maybe it's time for us to get converted.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what's a great possibility for us as we move forward.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's really cool. Awesome. Well, thanks, Brian. That was a great conversation. Really appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of New Zealand.
And keep up the good work with the podcast.